The courtroom was cold enough that I kept my coat on. Not the cold of weather. Savannah in October never gets that far. But the cold that lives inside county buildings, the kind that seeps up through the floor and settles in an old woman's knees. I sat very still in that cold, my hands folded on top of my mother's old leather purse, and I listened to a young lawyer in a gray suit tell a room full of strangers that I had lost my mind. His name was Bradford Sloan. He had shoes that clicked against the wood floor like a clock, and he walked back and forth in front of the judge's bench while he talked, turning every few steps to point one manicured finger in my direction. "What we have here," he said, "is a woman in decline, a grieving widow, confused, forgetful, a woman who can no longer be trusted with a checkbook, let alone a family fortune. The family isn't here to punish her. The family is here to protect her from herself." He said it so smoothly, so kindly. That was the part that turned my stomach, how kind cruelty can sound when it puts on a good suit. I did not move. On the outside, I was calm. I have buried a mother, a father, 2 brothers, and the only man I ever loved. And you learn after all that how to keep your face still while the world tells you lies about your own life. But on the inside, my heart was going like the drum on Easter Sunday, loud and fast and holy. I was not afraid, though, and that surprised even me. Across the aisle at the other table sat my son, my Terrence, 40 years old and staring down at his own hands like they belonged to somebody else. He would not look at me. Beside him sat his wife Vanessa, spine straight as a fence post, chin up, a small, satisfied smile resting on her mouth, like she already knew how this was going to end. She thought she knew. They had spent 6 months building a case to prove I'd lost my mind. 6 months of lawyers and doctors and papers with my name typed at the top. What they did not know not one soul in that room knew except an old man named Ezra and a lawyer named Loretta, was that my husband, God, rest his soul, had spent his last breath on this earth, making sure I would never lose a single thing. They just hadn't found out yet. If you're watching this, do me a favor before I go on. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. What city, what state, what country? I want to know I'm not talking to an empty room. Because what happened to me could happen to anybody's mother, anybody's grandmother, maybe yours. Now let me take you back to the beginning so you understand exactly what they tried to steal. My name is Celine Coleman. I am 64 years old, and for 37 years I got out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning before the birds, before the light, before God himself seemed fully awake to make biscuits. Not from a can, not from a box, from flour and buttermilk and cold butter cut in with my own 2 hands in a stainless steel bowl that my Walter bought me the week we opened. The Coleman Table, we called it. A soul food restaurant on the east side of Savannah, tucked into a brick building on a corner that back then nobody wanted in a neighborhood the city liked to forget. We opened in 1988, and from that first morning until the winter of this very year, I balanced the books of that restaurant every single night at the kitchen table by hand in a green ledger after the last customer left, and the last plate was dried. I never went past the 10th grade. My daddy needed me picking, and then my mama got sick, and school was a luxury for other people's children. So I taught myself. I taught myself to read a profit and loss statement out of a library book. I taught myself to figure payroll and sales tax and vendor accounts. There is not a number that ever passed through that restaurant that I could not tell you the story of. Remember that. It matters later. And here is the thing I want you to hold on to about who I was before any of this started. I knew my people. I knew that Deacon Roy took his grits with no sugar and his coffee with too much. I knew that Miss Ella, who buried her husband the same spring I met mine, always ordered the fried whiting on Fridays, because that's what he used to order, and she couldn't quite stop. I knew the regulars' names, their children's names, their orders, their sorrows. Some of them are gone now, and I still know. That restaurant wasn't a business to me. It was the beating heart of that neighborhood, and I was the one who kept it beating. A woman who remembers all that does not forget how to write a check. I met Walter Coleman in 1981 at a church fish fry, and I married him in 1982. And if I live to be 100, I will never understand what a man like that saw in a girl like me. Walter was tall and slow-talking and steady as a Sunday. He was a carpenter by trade and a dreamer by nature, and it was Walter who looked at that ugly brick corner in 1987 and said, "Celine, I can see the tables from here." We had our boy first. Terrence came in 1985, 3 years before the restaurant, and Lord, that child grew up in that kitchen. By the time he was 7 years old, he was standing up on a milk crate at the sink sleeves rolled to the elbow, wiping down tables like it was the most important job in the world. Walter used to put a hand on that boy's little shoulder and say to anybody who'd listen, "You see this one? This one right here is the future of this house. I want you to remember that boy on the milk crate, because the man who would not look at me across that courtroom that was the same person, that is what made it hurt the way it did. Not the money, never the money, the milk crate. For a long time we were happy, not rich happy. There's a difference that took me 60 years to fully appreciate. The trouble, if I'm honest, walked in the door in 2005 wearing a nice dress and a nicer smile, and her name was Vanessa. Terrence brought her home and married her that same year, and I will not sit here and tell you I hated her from the start, because I didn't. I tried. God knows I tried. She was pretty and polished, and she called me Miss Celine and complimented my cornbread. But there was something behind her eyes that never quite matched her mouth. A coldness, a counting. Walter saw it before I did. Walter always saw people clear. He never said an unkind word about her out loud that wasn't his way, but I noticed that whenever Vanessa started in about money, about what the restaurant was worth, about how that whole block is going to be worth a fortune someday, my husband would get very quiet and change the subject. He kept a careful, watchful peace with that woman for 16 years. As long as Walter was alive, Vanessa kept her hands folded in her lap, and then in the spring of 2021, the cancer that had been eating at Walter for a year finally took him, and the folded hands came apart. I didn't see it right away. Grief makes you blind. For the first year after I buried Walter, I moved through the world like a woman underwater, and I let Terrence and Vanessa help me with things. Because that's what you do. You let your children help, and because I did not have the strength to notice that help and control can wear the exact same face. Vanessa had worked for years in medical billing hospitals, insurance, the paperwork side of sickness. I used to think that was a fine, respectable job. I didn't understand yet that it had taught her exactly how a doctor's signature looks, exactly how an official medical form is supposed to read, exactly which papers a person can forge, and how and what they can buy you. I didn't understand any of that. Not until a Tuesday afternoon in April of this year, when I walked out to my mailbox in my house shoes and pulled out an envelope from the Chatham County Probate Court and opened it, standing right there on the sidewalk in the sun, and read the words that said my own son was asking a judge to declare me incompetent. I read that letter 3 times standing on the sidewalk, and the words did not change. Petition for appointment of conservator. In the interest of Celine Coleman, an adult alleged to be incapacitated. Filed by Terrence Coleman. My boy, my milk crate boy. There was a phrase in there that I keep hearing even now, months later, when I'm trying to fall asleep. Diminished capacity. Like I was a battery running down. Like a light somebody was fixing to switch off. Stapled to the back of the petition was a document I had never seen before in my life. A psychological evaluation. 2 pages full of words like disorientation and impaired judgment and inability to manage financial affairs. And at the bottom, a signature and a stamp, Dr. Raymond Pell. I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it plain, because it is the center of this whole story. I had never met Dr. Raymond Pell. Not once. Not in an office, not in a hospital, not on a telephone, not on a street corner. I did not know the man's face. I could not have picked him out of a crowd of 2. And yet there were 2 pages signed in his name telling a judge in detail about the state of my mind, a mind he had never once been in the same room with. I went inside. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd balanced 37 years of ledgers, and I pulled out my bank statements, and I started doing what I have always done best. I started following the money, and that's when I found the second thing, withdrawals. Starting back in 2021, right after Walter died, when I was underwater with grief and not looking. A little at first, then more. Over 4 years, $40,000 had walked out of my accounts, and every one of those transactions had been authorized by a power of attorney. A power of attorney that gave Terrence the right to act on my behalf. A power of attorney with my signature at the bottom. I never signed a power of attorney. Not ever. Not once in my life. I sat there and I looked at that signature, my name in a hand that was almost mine, but not quite the S, a little too tall, the loop on the E a little too round, and I felt something in my chest go very cold and very still. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a worried son overreacting. This was a plan. Somebody had sat down on purpose with time and patience and built this, forged a signature, bought a doctor's name, filed it with a court, and smiled at me across the Thanksgiving table the whole while. I did the thing a mother does. Before I called any lawyer, before I did anything else, I got in my car and I drove to my son's house because I believed. I still believed, God help me, that if I could just look Terrence in the eye, mother to child, this whole thing would come apart like a bad dream. I never got to look him in the eye. Vanessa opened the door. She stood in the gap of it, one hand on the frame, blocking the way in the polite manner of a woman who has practiced blocking doorways, and she gave me that smile that never reached her eyes. "Miss Celine," she said, "you shouldn't have driven all this way. You're not well. I'd like to speak to my son. Terrence is resting. He's been under so much stress worrying about you." She tilted her head the way you'd tilt it at a child. "We're doing this for you. You know that, don't you? Somebody has to look after that money now that Daddy Walter's gone. You can't be expected to manage all that on your own. Not at your age. Not in your state. Your state. Like I was a ruin. Like I was a house with the roof caving in." Behind her, deep in the house, I heard a door close. Soft. Careful. My son choosing not to come to the front of his own home because his mother was standing in it. I called him 6 times over the next 2 days. 6 times it rang and went to a recording of his voice, that grown man's voice that used to be a little boy's voice, hollering across a restaurant dining room. 6 times. On the second night, I sat alone at my kitchen table in the dark, and I said out loud to the empty house, to Walter, to God, to whoever was listening, "I buried the love of my life. I will not let them bury me while I'm still breathing." The next morning, I opened the phone book. Yes, I still keep a phone book, and I found a lawyer. Loretta Briggs did not look like a woman who won things. Her office was above a nail salon on Abercorn Street. The carpet was the color of weak coffee, and there were file boxes stacked in the corner, like she'd never quite finished moving in. She was maybe 50, built solid with reading glasses pushed up into gray streaked hair, and a way of looking at you like she'd already heard every lie in the world. And yours had better be the truth. I spread it all out on her desk. The petition, the evaluation from the doctor I'd never met, the bank statements, the forged power of attorney. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just read one page after another, her lips pressed flat. "Mrs. Coleman," she finally said, taking off her glasses, "I want to explain something to you, and I need you to understand it isn't a small thing. What you're describing has a name. It's called guardianship abuse or conservatorship abuse, and it is one of the fastest, quietest, ugliest ways there is to rob an older person blind. It happens more than anybody wants to admit. Somebody gets a court to declare that Mama can't think straight, and once that order is signed, Mama can't touch her own bank account, can't sign her own name, can't say no. The person the court appoints controls everything. The house, the money, the property, everything. They want to sell the restaurant, I said, and the lot beside it. How much is that worth? I told her what a developer had offered on the block the year before. $4.5 million. Loretta went very still. Then that, she said, is your motive, right there. That's 4.5 million reasons. She told me the fight would not be easy. To win, we would have to do two things at once. We would have to prove I was competent, genuinely provably sharp as I'd ever been. And we would have to prove that this was not about protecting me at all, but about money. She said the burden would be on us, that a probate judge who sees a 40-year-old son and a nice family and a doctor's signature is inclined to believe them, and that I should prepare myself for people to speak about me in that courtroom like I was already gone. Then she offered me something I didn't take. She said the other side's lawyer had already reached out, they wanted to settle. If I would just voluntarily sign over management of my affairs, agree to be looked after, I could stay in my home. They'd give me an allowance, a monthly sum, spending money in my own life, off of my own labor. No, I said. Loretta nodded slowly, like she'd hoped I'd say it, and then she picked the doctor's evaluation back up, and she held it under her desk lamp, and she went quiet in a different way than before. Mrs. Coleman, she said, this license number, Dr. Pell's. Georgia licenses have a format, and the year of issue is coded into it. She tapped the page. This number doesn't match the seal above it. They don't line up. She looked up at me over the lamp. I've seen a lot of these, and I don't think this doctor ever laid eyes on you. I think somebody typed his name onto a form and forged his signature the same way they forged yours on that power of attorney. The room seemed to tilt. You're telling me it's fake, I said. The whole thing, the doctor too. I'm telling you, Loretta said, that this just stopped being a family disagreement. Forging a physician's signature on a court document is a felony. What we are looking at, Mrs. Coleman, is a crime. The days before the trial were the longest days of my life since Walter's funeral. My younger sister Della came and stayed with me. Della Hollis, sharp-tongued, big-hearted, 3 years younger than me, and twice as stubborn. She sat at my kitchen table and held my hand, and being Della told me exactly what she thought. Sister, let it go, she said. You don't need to sit in no courtroom and let those people call you crazy in front of the whole city. Take the settlement. Keep your dignity. Walk away. There is no dignity, I told her, in letting somebody steal your name and thanking them for the allowance. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she squeezed my hand and said, All right then. All right. But if you're going to war, you go dressed right. And she was quiet after that, and she stayed. The night before, I couldn't sleep, so I went out to the garage where I'd stacked Walter's things after he passed boxes I hadn't been able to open in 4 years. And I don't know what made me do it, but I opened one. And on top, tucked into an old address book, I found a business card. Plain cream-colored. Ezra Whitfield, an old friend of Walter's, from way back, a man I'd met maybe a dozen times over the years, quiet and dignified, who'd stood at the very back at the funeral and left before I could thank him for coming. And on the back of that card, in Walter's own handwriting, that careful carpenter's print I would know anywhere, were 7 words. If anything ever feels wrong, call Ezra first. I stood in that cold garage and I read it maybe 10 times. Walter had been gone 4 years. And here he was, reaching a hand out of the dark to steady me. I called the number at 2 o'clock in the morning. I didn't even think about the hour. An old man's voice answered on the second ring, wide awake, like he'd been sitting up, waiting on a phone that took 4 years to ring. Mrs. Coleman, Ezra said before I'd hardly spoken. Walter told me this day might come. I started to ask him what he meant. He stopped me, gentle but firm. Not on the telephone. I'll see you at the courthouse. A pause. And Celine, don't ask me what I'm bringing. It's better that you don't know. You just walk in there tomorrow and be honest. Let the rest of it come. And he hung up. And I sat there in the dark, holding the phone, more confused and more comforted than I had been in months. I woke before dawn the way I have woken before dawn for 37 years. Old habits don't die just because the restaurant's dark. I dressed carefully. Della saw to that. A navy blue coat, the good one, The one Walter always said made me look like a woman who owned the room. I pinned my mother's brooch to the collar. I put on my mother's leather purse over my arm. I drove to the courthouse the long way on purpose so I could pass the restaurant. The Coleman table. Dark now. Chairs up on the tables. A paper sign in the window that Vanessa's people had put there. Closed like it was nothing, like 37 years of biscuits and funerals and first dates and Sunday dinners was just a thing you could close with a sheet of printer paper. I slowed the car. I looked at it for 1 second. Then I drove on because if I looked any longer, I would not have made it to that courtroom at all. Ezra was waiting for me in the lobby, leaning on a cane in a suit that had been pressed within an inch of its life. He didn't say much. He just took my hand and pressed something into it, a sealed envelope, cream-colored, heavier than paper ought to be. "Walter said to give you this the morning it begins," he said. "But you're not to open it until it's over. You hear me? Not until it's over." I put it in my purse next to my heart, unopened. Loretta found me a moment later and leaned close. "One more thing before we go in," she murmured. "There are things I know that you don't. I've kept some of it from you on purpose, and I need you to trust me on that. When you're on that stand, I want every reaction on your face to be real. I don't want you performing. I want them to see the truth of you. Can you do that for me?" I didn't understand, but I said yes. And then I saw them down the hall. Vanessa in a gray dress, cool as marble, and beside her, my son. For 1/2 of 1 second, Terrence lifted his eyes and looked at me across that long marble corridor. And then he looked away first. I walked into that cold courtroom and I sat down, and I folded my hands on my mother's purse, and a young man in a gray suit stood up and began to tell the world I had lost my mind. "Before we go into that courtroom together, do one thing for me. If you believe an old woman deserves to be heard, if you've ever had somebody look at your gray hair and decide you didn't matter, hit that subscribe button and stay with me. Because what happened after those doors closed is the reason I'm telling this story at all. I told you how it began, the cold room, the clicking shoes, the young man in the gray suit pointing his finger and calling me a woman in decline. Now let me tell you how the rest of that morning went, because you need to feel how far down they took me before the afternoon came. There was no jury. I want you to understand that. In a case like this, there's no 12 people in a box. There is one judge, and that judge decides everything, your money, your freedom, your very mind, with a single signature. Her name was the Honorable Adeline Foster, a black woman near about my own age, with silver in her hair and eyes that missed nothing. She sat up there behind the bench and she watched. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just watched, and I could not for the life of me tell what she was thinking, and that terrified me more than anything Sloane said. Bradford Sloane finished painting his picture of me. And Lord, what a picture! To hear him tell it, I was a poor, confused old thing who left pots burning on the stove until the smoke alarms went off. Who got lost driving home from a grocery store I'd shopped at for 20 years. Who gave money to strangers, forgot what day it was, couldn't be trusted to remember her own grandchild's birthday. He said the word grieving about 9 times, always soft, always sorry, like he was doing me a mercy. "Your Honor," he said, "no one is the villain here. This is a family that loves their mother and is watching her slip away. All they want is to protect her and to protect what her late husband worked so hard to build before it's lost to confusion and poor judgment." I sat and I listened to a stranger describe a woman who was not me, had never been me. And I understood for the first time in my life how a person could be robbed in broad daylight in a room full of officials and have everyone in the room call it kindness. Then they brought their witnesses. The first was a woman named Brenda Ackerman. She wore scrubs to the courtroom, a nice touch that made her look official medical trustworthy. She testified that she had been hired to look after me and had observed me closely, and she told her stories. That I'd repeated the same question 3 times in an hour. That she'd found the stove burner glowing red with nothing on it. That I'd called her by the wrong name, that I seemed lost in my own home. She said it all so smoothly, And I'll be honest with you, sitting there listening, watching Judge Foster's face give nothing away, I felt the floor of my own certainty start to soften. That's the poison of a thing like this. They say it enough in enough detail with enough sorrow in their voices, and you start to wonder yourself. Did I leave that burner on? Did I forget her name? Am I? And then I caught myself, because I knew exactly who I was. Loretta stood up to cross-examine her, and she was gentle, almost lazy about it, right up until she wasn't. Miss Ackerman, how long have you worked for Mrs. Coleman? About 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Loretta let that sit. And who hired you? Mrs. Vanessa Coleman. Who signs your paychecks? A pause. Mrs. Vanessa Coleman. So in the whole of your 3 weeks of acquaintance with my client paid for by the very woman who stands to gain millions if my client is declared incompetent, you never once saw Mrs. Coleman do a single competent thing. Never saw her cook a full meal, hold a conversation, balance her checkbook. There were good days. There were good days, Loretta repeated softly and sat down. It landed. I saw one corner of Judge Foster's mouth move just barely. It was a good hit, but it was not enough, and Loretta had told me it wouldn't be. A biased witness is a scratch. What came next was the wound. Sloan rose and he buttoned his jacket and he said the words that stopped my heart. Your Honor, the petitioner calls Terrence Coleman. And my son stood up. He walked to that witness stand slow like a man walking to something he didn't want to reach. And he sat down and he put his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, and the whole time he did not look at me. Not once. He looked at his own knees. He looked at the judge. He looked at Sloan. He looked everywhere in that room except the one chair that held the woman who carried him under her heart for 9 months, and on her hip for 5 years after that. Sloan was gentle with him, fed him easy questions, and Terrence answered them in a voice I had never heard come out of my boy, small and shaking and rehearsed. He said I wasn't myself anymore. He said that since his father died, I'd changed, gotten forgetful, made decisions that scared him. He said he'd seen the doctor's report, the one for a doctor I never met, and it had broken his heart, but he had to face facts. He said he'd tried to talk to me, and I wouldn't listen. He said he was only doing this because he was afraid of what would happen to me if he didn't. And then Sloan asked him soft as a lullaby, Terrence, why are you here today? Why put your own mother through this? And my son looked down at his hands and his voice cracked right down the middle and he said, because I love my mother. That's why I have to do this. I want to tell you what I was looking at in the second he said it. I was looking at his hands because I could still see them at 7 years old. Those hands small and soap wet, gripping a rag, wiping down table 4 while he stood up on a milk crate to reach because he was too short otherwise. I could still hear Walter's voice booming across that dining room. You see this one? This one right here is the future of this house. For more than 30 years, that memory had lived in me. And now the future of my house sat up on a witness stand and told a judge his mother had lost her mind and called it love. It was not the money. I need you to understand that. If you take one thing from my whole story, take this. It was never ever about the money. It was the milk crate. It was watching the little boy I raised become a man who would do this and dress it up in the word love and mean it. I did not cry out. I did not make a sound. I have too much of my own mother in me for that. But one tear went down my face, and I lifted my hand and wiped it away with the back of my knuckles. The back of the same hand that had kneaded 37 years of biscuit dough before dawn. The hand that fed that boy. The hand he was now telling the world could not be trusted. Beside me, Loretta leaned in close, so close her lips barely moved, and she whispered 4 words that were the only thing holding me to that chair. Hold on, the afternoon is ours. Judge Foster called the recess at noon. Loretta took me by the arm and walked me, steadied me really out of that courtroom and down the hall into a little windowless conference room, and she shut the door, and the second it clicked, she was a different woman. The gentle, lazy lawyer from the cross-examination was gone. This one had fire in her. "Saline," she said, "sit down. I've got something and I've been sitting on it all morning and it is going to end this." She spread a document out on the table. It was the forged power of attorney, the one with my not-quite signature, the one they'd used to bleed $40,000 out of me over 4 years. "Now watch," she said. She put her finger on the bottom of the page on the notary block. "Every legal signature like this has to be notarized, witnessed, and stamped by a licensed notary public, an official who swears they watched you sign. The notary who supposedly witnessed you signing this, the one who stamped it and swore under the law that Celine Coleman appeared before her in person on June the 14th, 2021, and signed this document with her own hand. Her name was Clara Nunn." "I don't know any Clara Nunn." "No," Loretta said, and her eyes were bright and hard. "You wouldn't, because I pulled the records this week." She slid a second paper across the table, her obituary, and clipped behind it a certified copy of her death certificate. Clara Nunn died in October of 2019, a year and a half before the date on this document. The room went very quiet. "A dead woman," Loretta said slowly, "cannot notarize a signature. A dead woman cannot swear she watched you sign anything, which means this notary stamp is forged, which means this entire power of attorney, the legal key they used to unlock your bank accounts for 4 years, is a fake from top to bottom, and provably so. Not a matter of opinion. Not my word against theirs. A public death record against a court document. There is no explaining this away. I sat down because my legs weren't sure they wanted to hold me. And there's more," she said, gentler now. "That date. June 14th, 2021. You told me weeks ago when we went through your calendar where you were that whole month." She pulled out a folder, a registration form, a receipt, a little strip of photographs. "You were at the grief retreat, the church women's retreat, in Beaufort, South Carolina. 3 days. You've got the registration, the receipts, and a room full of church sisters who'll swear you never left." She tapped the forged document. "So they've got you signing a paper in Savannah, witnessed by a woman who'd been dead 2 years on a day you were 2 states over, crying in a prayer circle over your dead husband." I put my hand over my mouth. All this time I had been sitting in that courtroom feeling the floor soften under me, half wondering if maybe I had left the burner on, maybe I was slipping, and the whole while Loretta was holding a death certificate that proved the entire thing was built on a lie. "Do you see, Saline?" she said. "The power of attorney in 2021, that was the quiet part. That's how they moved the money while nobody was watching. But you can't sell a $4.5 million property on a quiet forged signature. For that, they needed a court's blessing. They needed you declared incompetent out in the open by a judge. That's what this whole trial is. It's not a new thing. It's the same crime 4 years later wearing a nicer suit." I reached into my purse without thinking, and my fingers found the sealed envelope Ezra had pressed into my hand that morning. Walter's envelope. I don't even know what I meant to do with it. I just needed to touch something of his. Loretta saw. She reached across and put her hand over mine over the envelope and shook her head once. "Not yet," she said. "Whatever that is, not yet. Let them have their afternoon. Let them stand up and think they're winning." Something moved behind her eyes that I can only call anticipation. "Because we are about to walk back into that room, and everything they built over 6 months is going to come down in about an hour. And I want them to be standing at the very top of it when it does." We walked back into that courtroom at 1 o'clock, and I swear the light was different. Or maybe I was different. I sat down in the same cold chair, but this time I wasn't holding on for dear life. This time I was waiting. Judge Foster settled into her seat and looked at my lawyer. "Ms. Briggs, the respondent may present her case." And Loretta stood up, buttoned her jacket the same way Sloan had buttoned his that morning, and said in a voice that filled the whole room, "Your Honor, the respondent calls Ezra Whitfield." I turned around. And down the center aisle of that courtroom came an old man leaning on a cane in a pressed brown suit, walking slow and steady toward the front. Across the aisle, I watched Vanessa's face, and for the first time all day, that satisfied little smile flickered. She didn't know who this was. Neither did Terrence. But something in the way the old man walked told them both to be afraid. Ezra took the stand. He was sworn in. And when Loretta asked him to state his relationship to the family, he looked not at her, not at the judge, but straight at me, and he said, "Walter Coleman was my best friend for 51 years. And before he died, he asked me to do one last thing for him. He asked me to protect his wife." He testified without a drop of feeling in his voice, and that was what made it land like a hammer. No tears, no drama, just an old man laying down facts like bricks. In December of 2020, 3 months before he passed, when he knew the cancer had won, Walter Coleman had quietly gone to a lawyer and created an irrevocable trust. Into that trust, he had placed everything that mattered, the restaurant, the building, the lot beside it. All of it. An irrevocable trust, Loretta said for the benefit of the room, means the property inside it no longer belongs to any one person outright. It cannot be sold or seized or stolen on any single person's say-so. It belongs to the trust, and it is governed by the trust's rules. She turned to Ezra. "And who did Walter name to benefit from that trust?" "Annie." "His wife, Celine, for the rest of her life." "And who did he name to protect it, to make sure no one could ever misuse it?" "Me," Ezra said. "As independent successor trustee, with a clause Walter insisted on. He called it the protection clause." For the first time, the old man's voice caught just slightly. "It says that if anyone ever tries to have Celine declared incompetent in order to take control of these assets, control passes immediately and permanently to me, and my only job, my only legal duty is to hold everything safe for her benefit. Not for the son, not for anybody else. For her." The room was dead silent. "Do you understand what that meant?" I did not fully nod until Loretta spelled it out. It meant that this entire trial, the forged doctor, the forged notary, the 6 months of scheming the caregiver in her scrubs, my own son on the witness stand, all of it had been for nothing. Even if Judge Foster had banged her gavel and declared me the most incompetent woman in the state of Georgia, they still could never have touched that property. Walter had locked the door 4 years ago and handed the only key to a man they'd never heard of. They had built their whole scheme on a house they never owned. "There is one more thing," Loretta said quietly. "Mr. Whitfield, did Walter leave anything else in your keeping?" "He did," Ezra said. "He left a recording. He made me promise to play it only if it ever came to this." And Loretta wheeled out a screen and the courtroom lights dropped, and there on that screen was my husband. I had not seen Walter's face move in 4 years. He was thin. God, he was so thin, sitting in his old armchair in a sweater that had gone too big for him. And I knew that room, I knew that light. It was our den in the winter of 2020. And I must have been at the store or at church, and he had done this while I was gone, so I wouldn't see, so I wouldn't cry. He looked right into the camera, right at me across 4 years in the grave. "Celine," he said, "if you're watching this in a courtroom, then the thing I feared has happened. And I'm so sorry, baby. I'm sorry I'm not there to stand beside you." I heard myself make a sound I've never made before. "I set all this up," he said, "so that no one can ever take what we built. Not the money. The money was never the thing. What we built was 37 years of getting up before the sun. It was every plate we ever served. It's ours, and I made sure it stays yours." He leaned toward the camera, and even wasted down to nothing, his eyes were steady and clear. "Trust Ezra. He'll know what to do. And Celine, listen to me now. Whatever they said about you in that room today, whatever names they called you." He paused. "You were never confused a day in your life. Not one. You are the sharpest, strongest woman I have ever known, And don't you let anybody in that room tell you different. I love you. I'll see you again." And the screen went dark. I had my hand pressed over my mouth to keep from breaking apart. And across the aisle I saw my son Terrence drop his head into both his hands. But I couldn't think about him. I could only think about a dying man who in the last winter of his life had spent his failing strength building a wall around me that would still be standing long after he was gone. But Loretta was not done. She had told me she wanted them standing at the top of it when it came down. Now she brought it down. She turned from the darkened screen and picked up a stack of documents, and she went to work fast and merciless. First, the power of attorney. She put it up on the screen and she told the whole room what she'd told me at lunch, that the notary who supposedly witnessed my signature, Clara Nunn, had been dead a year and a half before the date on the document. She put the certified death certificate up beside it. A death record against a court filing. A deceased woman, she said, cannot witness a signing. This document is a forgery, and it is the forgery they used to remove $40,000 from Mrs. Coleman's accounts. Then she called Dr. Raymond Pell to the stand, the real one in the flesh, a nervous man in glasses who Loretta had tracked down and subpoenaed. And under oath, Dr. Pell testified that he had never met me, had never evaluated me, had never signed that report, that his signature had been copied and his name used without his knowledge or consent. "I don't know this woman," he said, looking at me almost apologetically. "I've never seen her before in my life." The judge was leaning forward now, watching, missing nothing, and then Loretta delivered the last one, the one that turned the whole story inside out. Twist 3. "Your Honor, the respondent's family has told this court again and again that this case is about protecting Mrs. Coleman, about love, about concern for her well-being." She held up a single sheet of paper. "I'd like to enter into evidence a private agreement signed 3 months ago between Vanessa Coleman and Gregory Hartwell of Hartwell Development, the developer who wishes to buy Mrs. Coleman's property. This agreement provides that upon the successful sale of that property, Vanessa Coleman will personally receive a $400,000 consulting fee, paid directly to her, into her own account, separate from anything shared with her husband." She let it hang there in the cold air. "This was never about protecting a mother," Loretta said. "This was about $400,000. And Vanessa Coleman had the means to make it happen because for 11 years, Your Honor, she worked in medical billing. She knew exactly how a physician's evaluation is supposed to look, exactly how to forge one. Motive, means, opportunity, all three in one person. And that's when the mask finally came off. Vanessa shot to her feet. "That's a lie," she said, and her voice was nothing like the smooth, sorrowful voice from before it was high and sharp and ugly. "You have no right." "Mrs. Coleman, sit down," Judge Foster said. "She's turning everybody against Mrs. Coleman." The gavel came down once hard as a rifle shot. "You will sit down and you will be silent, or I will have you removed from my courtroom. Do you understand me?" Vanessa sat, but it was too late. Everyone in that room had seen it, the marble crack straight down the middle, and the cold thing that had been living behind it all along. But I wasn't watching Vanessa. I was watching my son, because when Loretta held up that $400,000 agreement, Terrence's head had come up out of his hands, and he had turned and looked at his wife with an expression I will never forget as long as I live. It was not the face of a man caught in a scheme. It was the face of a man just now finding out. He hadn't known. God help me, my boy hadn't known. He'd known his mother was declining because his wife had shown him report after report, doctor's letter after doctor's letter, forged, every one of them feeding him a slow poison of lies about me until he believed them. He thought he was saving me. He never knew about the dead notary or the $400,000 or any of it. He was weak, and he was a fool, and he had wronged me in a way that would take years to heal. But he was not the architect. He was just another thing she'd forged. I don't know if that made it better or worse. Even now I don't know. Sloan was drowning, and he knew it, and a drowning man grabs at anything. He asked the judge for permission to question me directly. He was going to try one last desperate time to make me look confused on that stand in front of everybody to salvage something, anything from the wreck. So they called me. And I walked up to that witness stand slow because my knees are 64 years old, but straight because my spine is older than that, and it has never once bent. And I put my hand on the Bible, and I swore to tell the truth. And for the first time all day, I was not afraid at all. Sloan came at me fast. What year was it? What day of the week? Who was the president? When did my husband die? What did I have for breakfast? Question on top of question quick, trying to rattle me, trying to trip an old woman into stammering. I answered every one. Calm, clear, not one beat missed. Then he got clever. He started in on numbers on the business, thinking that's where a confused old woman would surely fall apart. What was the restaurant's revenue in a given year? What did I pay in sales tax? Who were my vendors? And I looked at that young man in his gray suit, and something in me that had been folded up small all day finally stood all the way up. I told him the revenue. For that year and the year before and the year before that. I told him the name of the produce supplier we'd used since 1991, and the name of the man who delivered the fish, and the day of the month I filed the sales tax every month for 37 years. I recited it like scripture because it was scripture to me. And the courtroom got quieter and quieter with every number, and Sloane's clever little smile got smaller and smaller. And then I stopped, and I looked at him. And I said low, and even so the whole room had to lean in to catch it. Young man, I have balanced that restaurant's books every single night for 37 years. Through my husband's cancer, through his funeral, through the loneliest mornings of my life when I got up at 5 o'clock to make biscuits for a dining room alone because it was the only thing that kept me standing. You want to tell this court I can't count. I let it sit for 1 second. Then ask me anything, I dare you. Bradford Sloan opened his mouth, and then he closed it. And he sat down. He had no more questions. There were no more questions to ask. I thought it was over. I truly did. I started to rise from the stand. And Loretta stood up and said, Your Honor, the respondent has one final witness. I looked at her. This wasn't in anything she'd told me, and she wouldn't meet my eyes, and I understood this was the thing she'd kept from me. The last thing. The respondent calls Maya Coleman, and the doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and my granddaughter walked in. Maya, 19 years old. Terrence and Vanessa's girl. My grandbaby, whom I had bounced on my knee in that restaurant, who used to fall asleep in the back booth while her grandmother closed out the register. She walked down that aisle, shaking like a leaf, but she walked straight, and she did not stop when her mother hissed her name, and she did not stop when her father half rose from his chair. She took the stand, and she was sworn in, and she made herself look at me for 1 second before she began. And in that look was every apology in the world. She testified in a small, trembling, clear voice. She said that a few weeks ago she'd been home from college, and she'd found her mother's laptop open on the kitchen table. And on the screen were documents. Draft after draft of a signature, my signature practiced over and over until it was right. Templates of medical forms. And a string of text messages between her mother and the developer, Hartwell talking about the timeline, the sale, the fee. She said she didn't want to believe it, so she did something. The next time her mother was on the phone about it, Maya had quietly recorded the call which her lawyer had told her she was allowed to do in the state of Georgia. And on that recording, her mother's own voice said the words that broke the last of it open. Loretta played it. And through the courtroom speakers, cold and clear, came Vanessa's voice laughing a little, saying, Relax. The old woman's the only real problem, and she's got no idea. Truth is, she's sharper than both of us put together. That's exactly why we had to move fast before she figured it out. She's sharper than both of us put together. Her own words. The whole scheme confessed in a sentence by the one person who knew for a fact I had never been confused a single day in my life. The courtroom erupted. The gavel came down. Vanessa was shouting, And Maya, my grandbaby, sat up on that stand with tears running clean down her face, and she looked at me and she said the thing I will carry with me to my own grave. Grandma taught me you don't get to keep what you steal. Her voice cracked. I'm sorry, Grandma. I'm sorry it took me so long. I stepped down from that witness stand. I walked past the lawyers, past the screen where my dead husband's face had been past the wreckage of 6 months of lies. I stopped just for a moment in front of my granddaughter, and I put my old hand against her wet cheek, and I let her see that she was forgiven. And then I walked back to my seat, and I did not look at my son. Judge Adeline Foster did not need long to think. She called a short recess, and she went back to her chambers. And when she came out again, the whole room stood, and I stood too, my hand gripping the edge of the table, and I made myself breathe. She did not raise her voice. She never had all day. She just laid it down plain and final, one line at a time. The petition for conservatorship was denied. In full. She found me, and she used my name when she said it, Mrs. Celine Coleman, to be of sound mind and full capacity, competent to manage every affair of my own life without limitation. She declared the power of attorney void and the withdrawals made under it unlawful. She set aside every agreement touching the sale of my property. And then she took off her glasses and she looked across her courtroom at Vanessa and at the lawyer Sloan, and her voice went cold in a way that made the air itself feel heavier. What has been presented in this courtroom today, she said, is not a family disagreement. It is fraud. It is forgery. It is the calculated financial exploitation of an elder, and it is a crime against the dignity of a woman who has more sense in her than most of the people who tried to take it from her. She turned to the clerk. I am referring the entirety of this matter, the forged medical evaluation, the forged power of attorney, the forged notarization, to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation and prosecution. She looked at me one last time, and I promise you the corner of that stern mouth lifted just barely, just for me. Mrs. Coleman, she said, this court apologizes for what you were made to sit through. You are free to go. And ma'am, the record will reflect that you were never anything less than entirely yourself. I did not cry out. I did not throw up my hands. Everyone expects the big scene, the weeping, the falling to the knees. It wasn't like that. I just closed my eyes, and I let out one long breath, a breath I realized I had been holding without knowing it for 4 years. Since the morning I buried Walter, and the folded hands came apart. I let it go, all of it, right there in that cold room, and when I opened my eyes again, the weight of 4 years was gone off my chest, and I could stand up straight without even trying. Behind me, I heard Vanessa's chair scrape as they let her out for questioning. I did not turn around to watch. She was not worth the turning of my neck. I did not want to see anybody. Not the reporters that had gathered on the courthouse steps. By then, an old black woman winning a case like this had become a small kind of news. Not the lawyers. Not even Della, not yet, though she was waiting. I just wanted to sit down. So I went to my car alone in the far corner of that parking lot, and I got in and I shut the door, and for a minute I just sat in the quiet with my hands in my lap. And then I remembered the envelope. Walter's envelope that Ezra had pressed into my hand that morning with the instruction, not until it's over. It was over. My hands were shaking as I opened it, not from weakness. Don't you dare think weakness, but from the weight of the man on the other side of it. Inside was a single photograph. Old. The colors gone soft and orange the way old photographs do. It was the two of us, Walter and me, standing in front of the Coleman table on opening day 1988. He had his arm around me and his chest puffed out like he'd built the whole city, and I was 27 years old and laughing at something my head thrown back in an apron I still own. Behind us, you could just make out the hand-painted sign, the paint barely dry. I turned it over. And on the back, in that careful carpenter's print, my Walter had written 8 words, and I don't know when, maybe that last winter, maybe years before, I'll never know. Whatever comes, this was real, W. I sat in that car and I held that little piece of paper against my chest, and I finally let myself cry. Not the courtroom, not the lawyers, Just me and Walter and a photograph, and 40 years and the truth that no forged signature and no lying doctor and no scheming daughter-in-law could ever touch it was real. All of it was real. And it was mine. After a while, I picked up my phone and I called my sister. Della answered before the first ring finished. "Well," she said. "It's over," I told her. And that was all either one of us could say for a long, long time. We just held our two phones, two old women 3 miles apart, and we sat in that silence together, and it said everything. Now I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and tell you it all turned into a fairy tale. I've had enough of pretty lies to last me the rest of my days. So let me tell you the true shape of things. Vanessa is facing criminal charges. Forgery, fraud, exploitation of an elder. Real charges with real consequences, and I will let the courts do what the courts do. I don't spend my nights thinking about her. She spent enough of my life already. My son wrote me a letter. It came about 3 weeks after the trial in his handwriting, thick, several pages. I know it's an apology. I know it's probably every true thing he's never found the courage to say to my face. I have not opened it. Maybe I will someday. Maybe when I'm ready. I love Terrence. He is my child. He came out of my own body, and a mother's love is not a faucet. You can shut off no matter how much the child deserves it shut. But love and forgiveness are two different rivers, and the second one is slower than the first, and I am not going to rush it just to make anybody comfortable. He believed I was broken because it was easier than seeing that his wife was rotten. That is a wound that closes on its own time, or it doesn't. I don't know yet which, and I've made my peace with not knowing. But here is what I can tell you. 3 months after that trial, I reopened the Coleman table. I took the closed sign out of the window and I threw it in the trash where it belonged. I turned the chairs back down off the tables. And on the first morning, I got up at 5 o'clock, before the birds, before the light. And I stood at that stainless steel bowl Walter bought me the week we opened, and I cut cold butter into flour with my own 2 hands, the same as I have done for 37 years, and I made the first batch of biscuits that Kitchen had smelled in far too long. I wasn't alone. Maya was there beside me, my granddaughter. She moved back to Savannah, couldn't stay in that house, and I don't blame her one bit, and she asked if she could learn. So there she was at 5 in the morning, sleeves rolled up flour to her elbows, watching my hands and trying to copy them, getting it wrong and slowly, slowly getting it right. The future of the house. That's what Walter used to say, standing behind a little boy on a milk crate. I used to think he was talking about Terrence. Turns out he was just early, and he had the wrong child. It's a small thing reopening a restaurant. In the scheme of the world, one soul food place on a corner in Savannah is a small, small thing. But it is mine. Every biscuit, every plate, every name of every regular living and dead. It is mine, and no one is ever going to take it or take me again. So that is my story. And if you've stayed with me all the way to the end of it, I want to leave you with something because I didn't go through all of that just to entertain you. If you are a woman of a certain age, if you have started to notice that people talk a little slower to you now, a little louder like you've gone simple just because you've gone gray, I need you to hear me. Trust your gut. When something feels wrong, it is wrong, and you are not being paranoid, and you are not too old to know your own mind. The day they start telling you that you can't be trusted with your own money, your own choices, your own life, that is the day you get yourself a witness and a lawyer and a spine, and you fight. What was done to me has a name: guardianship abuse, elder financial exploitation. It happens every single day in quiet courtrooms to people whose only crime is that they got old and somebody got greedy. Most of them never find their Ezra. Most of them never had a Walter. So I am telling this story for them and for you, and for whoever needs to hear an old woman say your age is not a weakness, and your voice is not gone, and you are not confused. They spent 6 months and a great deal of money trying to prove that Celine Coleman had lost her mind. They were wrong, and a judge said so. And my husband, even from the grave, even from a photograph in an envelope, even after 4 years in the ground, never doubted me for a single second. Neither should you doubt yourself. My name is Celine Coleman. Thank you for sitting with me. Thank you for listening. Now go make your biscuits.